He walked into the resort like he belonged, but the world didn't agree. What happened next changed everything. If this story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful moments that matter. The corridors of Wellington Crest whispered with polished silence, echoing only the soft shuffle of leather soles and the faint hum of climate control. The school, nestled high in the city's affluent hills, stood as a marble monument to privilege. Its students stepped out of imported SUVs and town cars tinted darker than secrets, wearing pressed uniforms and watches that cost more than some mortgages. Among them walked Tariq Carter, a 12-year-old boy with deep brown skin, a navy sweater worn at the elbows, and eyes that had learned too early the weight of being watched. He held his notebook close, the spiral edges bent from overuse, and moved as if measuring each step. It wasn't fear. It was calculation, the quiet restraint of someone who understood that every glance, every word, every silence could be a test. Tariq sat in the front row of his literature class, posture perfect, hands folded. He didn't try to disappear, but he never invited attention. When Mrs. Welling, silver-haired and perfumed with books and jasmine, asked the class for examples of metaphor in To Kill a Mockingbird, silence thickened like syrup. Then Tariq raised his hand. His voice, low but clear, spoke of injustice, of symbolism, of innocence weaponized and destroyed. Mrs. Welling nodded slowly, impressed. But from across the room came a sharp exhale, a sigh disguised as disgust. Camille Whitmore, draped in designer uniform and entitlement, leaned back in her seat with a smirk. Her blonde ponytail swished like punctuation. "Wow," she said, loudly enough for the back row to hear. "Didn't know they let the help sit in." Her friends giggled. A few students glanced at Tarek, then quickly away. No one laughed out loud, but no one spoke up either. Tariq didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His face stayed still, his hand lowered slowly, returning to his lap as if nothing had happened. But inside, a familiar weight settled. Not anger, not surprise. Just the tired silence of enduring. Again. Camille whispered something else, just for her clique. This place is for families who built it, not the ones who polished the floors. It was cruel, but it came wrapped in the silk of confidence, the kind inherited from a father who owned things like buildings and expectations. No teacher corrected her, not because they agreed, but because standing up to a Whitmore meant risking everything. It wasn't the first time. Camille's casual racism came laced in sarcasm and fake curiosity. She once asked if Tariq's mom cleaned houses near the school. Another time she'd accidentally confused him with the janitor's nephew. Each insult wore a smile. And each time, Tariq met them with silence. Not weakness, discipline. He had learned long ago that reacting made it worse. Dignity was his defiance. He used stillness like armor. Each moment endured a quiet victory. When the bell rang, Tariq took his time packing up. He waited until the others had left, notebook hugged to his chest. Camille brushed past him with one last jab. "Try not to get too comfortable, Carter. Not every room is meant for everyone." Her heels tapped down the hallway, trailed by laughter, the sound sharp and familiar. Outside the classroom, the world kept moving. But for Tariq, something had shifted. Not broken, solidified. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want attention. He just wanted to exist without apology. He walked alone to the edge of the campus, past banners announcing upcoming galas, fundraisers, and legacies. He knew that in this place, legacy was currency. His didn't buy much, yet. When he got home that afternoon, his mother was waiting in the kitchen, reviewing documents, her expression unreadable but tired. Amelia Carter was always tired, not with weakness, but the weight of excellence expected without rest. She looked up, saw her son's face, and paused. "School?" she asked simply. "Fine," Tariq answered. She studied him. "Camille again?" He shrugged. Nothing new. Amelia said nothing at first. She set down her pen, walked over, and gently adjusted the collar of his sweater. "You remember what I told you?" He nodded. "People see what they expect. And your job? To prove them wrong just by being who I am." She kissed the top of his head. "Exactly." Later that evening, Tariq sat at his desk, tracing the edges of his old notebook. Tomorrow they were going on a trip, a weekend at Solaria Resort. His mother had booked it weeks ago, a rare break from her grueling schedule. A retreat. He'd never stayed in a place like that before. His classmates had, Camille certainly had, but he was quietly excited. Not to be spoiled, but to feel, even for a moment, like he belonged in a world that didn't doubt him on sight. He packed carefully that night, only what was needed. One good shirt, a book, toothbrush. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. Walk with purpose, speak clearly, be better than they expect. He closed the zipper, sat down on the bed, and allowed himself one private thought. This time, I won't be invisible. Then he turned off the light and went to sleep. The morning sun stretched lazily across the marble terraces of Solaria Resort, gilding every surface in soft gold. The resort awoke in silence, not from sleep, but from poise. Waiters in snow-white uniforms moved like precision instruments across the breakfast pavilion, adjusting napkin folds, realigning cutlery, and placing fruit parfaits with surgical attention. Everything was choreographed. The sound of the sea drifted in, hushed and respectful, as though even nature knew not to disrupt perfection. In the corner of the terrace, under the elegant shade of a cream parasol, sat Camille Whitmore. She wore her wealth like perfume, subtle only to those who couldn't afford it. A silk scarf tied around her neck matched the gold tint of her sunglasses, which perched atop her smooth curls like a crown. She held a tall glass of cucumber water in one hand, and with the other she waved dismissively at a server who had the misfortune of bringing her a croissant that crumbled too loudly. "This is dry," she muttered. "Get the kitchen manager, again." The server bowed and vanished. Camille rolled her eyes. "It's like training pets," she said to no one in particular. Camille was not in a good mood. The eggs Benedict tasted like cafeteria mush, the berries were sour like public school, and the tablecloth had a wrinkle. 5 employees had already passed through her orbit in less than 20 minutes, each retreating with the kind of frantic obedience only the daughter of a powerful man could command. Richard Whitmore was not just her father. He was the general manager of Solaria Resort, a name that opened doors and silenced resistance. Camille loved it. The sway, the fear, the way people twice her age moved faster when she frowned. Power, to her, wasn't just natural. It was the default. Until, out of the corner of her eye, she caught a silhouette through the glass walls of the lobby. A boy, calm, steady, walking with the kind of poise that didn't belong to someone like him. Her eyes narrowed. No. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping the tile with a screech that made a busboy jump. A dish of preserves toppled as she turned and marched toward the lobby, ignoring the confused glances of staff and guests. Inside, the cool air of the atrium hit her skin like a slap. She pushed through the glass doors, heels clicking like gunshots on marble. There he was, Tariq Carter, standing at the front desk, wearing a navy-collared shirt, hands folded calmly, speaking to the receptionist with the same quiet tone he used in class. Camille froze for half a second. Her brain refused to accept what her eyes saw. He couldn't be here. Not here. Not alone. Not like he belonged. She stormed forward. "Excuse me?" she said, loud enough for heads to turn. "What is this?" The receptionist, Monica, looked up, startled. Tariq slowly turned, instantly recognizing the voice. Camille came closer, voice sharpened. "Is someone going to explain why he's standing at the front desk like a guest?" Monica stammered. "He has a reservation." "With who? Who on earth booked a suite for him?" Tariq spoke quietly. "My mother made the reservation. I'm just checking in." Camille laughed, loud, brittle, and ugly. "Your mother? Oh, please. What'd she do? Run errands for someone who actually belongs here?" Monica's eyes darted between the screen and Camille, panic blooming in her chest. "I swear," Camille hissed at the receptionist, "if you check him in, my father will have your job shredded by lunch. You understand?" She turned toward the bellhop. "Call security, now." Tariq stood his ground. His expression didn't change. Not one muscle. "My mother's name is Amelia Carter," he said, his voice even. "She booked the executive suite." Camille blinked. "That's rich. Who made up that name for you?" Just then, the click of heavy shoes broke through the rising tension. A man in a navy blazer strode from the side hall, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, and clearly used to being obeyed. Richard Whitmore. Camille turned to him, suddenly sweet. "Dad, thank God. He's trying to check into one of our top-floor suites. Says his mom booked it. Amelia Carter. Can you believe that?" Richard's eyes swept over Tariq in a single, dismissive glance. He didn't ask a question. He didn't check the computer. His tone was instant and final. "Son, this is private property. You need to leave." Tariq took a step back as Richard reached out and grabbed his arm. "Let's go," Richard said, pulling him toward the doors. Tariq stumbled slightly, surprised by the force. "Sir, please," he said. "I'm not pretending. I'm waiting for my mother." Richard didn't listen. "We've had enough of this. People thinking they can just sneak in here. What do you take us for?" Guests began whispering. Staff paused mid-step. Monica opened her mouth to speak, but then the lobby doors swung open. The air changed. Amelia Carter walked in like a verdict wrapped in grace. Dressed in a tailored slate-gray pantsuit, a briefcase in one hand, and heels that clicked with surgical precision, she moved like a woman who had no interest in justifying her presence. Her eyes locked instantly onto Tariq's arm, still gripped in Richard's hand. Her face remained calm. Her tone didn't rise. She didn't scream. She simply said with surgical clarity, "Take your hand off my son." The room froze. Every voice, every step, every whisper, gone. Richard turned slowly, his hand still hovering in the air where it had been. "Mrs. Carter?" Amelia stepped forward and, in one motion, produced a black badge holder. She flipped it open. Amelia Carter, Chief Executive Officer, Carter Legacy Hotels. Richard's face drained. Camille's mouth fell open. Monica nearly fainted behind the desk. "You just laid hands on a registered guest on property I own," Amelia continued, her tone flat and cutting. "You humiliated my son in front of your staff, your daughter, and a lobby full of witnesses." Camille tried to interrupt. "He looked like he didn't belong, okay? Anyone would have thought that." Amelia didn't even turn to her. She raised one hand, silencing the room. "You didn't ask his name. You didn't verify reservation. You didn't look for the truth. You saw a black boy and assumed he couldn't belong." She glanced toward Monica. "Would you kindly confirm the reservation?" Monica's fingers flew across the keys. Her voice trembled. "Yes, ma'am. Amelia Carter, Carter Suite, executive level. Notes say your son would arrive early. Concierge alert flagged." "Thank you," Amelia said without breaking eye contact with Richard. He stammered. "If I had known—" "You didn't need to know who he was," she cut in. "You only needed to recognize that he was a child and a guest. But your judgment saw trespasser. That's on you." Silence pressed down on the lobby like a storm cloud. Amelia took a step closer. Her voice, still calm, now felt final. "You are relieved of your duties, effective immediately." Gasps. "Security will escort you from the premises. A formal letter of termination and civil complaint will follow." Richard opened his mouth. Wait, you can't just—" "I just did." She turned to security. "Be courteous, more than he was to my son." Then she looked at Tariq. "Let's check in, baby." And together they walked toward the elevator. No fanfare, no gloating, just dignity. The entire lobby watched them go, not with pity, but with respect. The elevator doors closed behind them with a soft chime, muffling the murmurs still rippling through the lobby. Inside the lift, Amelia reached for her son's hand. Tariq didn't say anything. He just held on. The ride to the top floor of Solaria Resort was quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but full, of realization, of validation, of everything that had been silently endured for far too long. Tariq looked down at the floor numbers ticking upward. He wasn't sure what he was feeling yet. His pulse was steady, but his breath was shallow, and his fingers still felt the ghost of Richard Whitmore's grip. When the doors opened, a private concierge was already waiting, posture impeccable, eyes wide with nervous welcome. "Miss Carter, Master Carter, please, right this way," she said, her voice soft but precise. Tariq followed silently as they entered the Carter suite. It was sprawling, all polished wood and cream-toned luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the room, offering a sun-drenched view of the ocean that looked too calm to belong to a morning like this. Tariq walked to the glass and placed his hand against it. The coolness of the surface grounded him. Behind him, Amelia set her briefcase down on the marble table. She didn't rush to speak. She knew better. She watched her son, the way his shoulders tensed and released, the way his jaw remained firm even when the battle was already over. "Talk to me," she said gently. Tariq didn't look away from the ocean. "He didn't even ask my name." "I know." "He grabbed me like I was nothing." "You were something. That's what scared him." He finally turned. "But why do I have to always be calm? Why do I have to be better to be equal?" Amelia stepped closer. "Because the world still hasn't figured out how wrong it is. And until it does, our dignity is our resistance. But that doesn't mean you can't feel it. All of it. You don't have to swallow the hurt to survive it." Tariq nodded slowly. "I just didn't want to cry." "Baby," she said, cupping his face, "you didn't cry. You didn't break. And you didn't back down. That's more than most grown men manage on their best days." They stood in silence for a moment longer before Tariq pulled away, heading to his room. He wanted a minute alone, just to breathe. Downstairs, the fallout was only beginning. Security had escorted Richard Whitmore to his office, where he stood frozen, surrounded by the luxury he'd once commanded with a glance. His keycard had already been disabled. An assistant was hurriedly packing his belongings into boxes. Staff passed the doorway with eyes averted. The confidence he'd worn like armor was gone, peeled away by 6 words. "You assaulted the owner's son." He tried to call his legal counsel, no answer. He tried to access the guest system to defend his decisions, denied. His voice rose in the hallway, demanding to speak to the board. But the board already had access to the footage. There was nothing left to argue. Meanwhile, Camille stood in her room, stunned, pale, and cornered by silence. She had returned there after the confrontation, heart hammering, ears still burning from her mother's voice echoing in her head. Not her actual mother. Amelia Carter. A woman who had just turned her world inside out in front of a crowd. Camille didn't know what to feel. Outrage, fear, shame. Mostly shame. It clung to her, unfamiliar and itchy, like a sweater she never thought she'd wear. For the first time in her life, her last name hadn't protected her. It had damned her. She sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through social media. The confrontation had already hit a few travel blogs. One staff member had anonymously posted a blurred photo of Amelia's badge, CEO Carter Legacy Hotels. Comments were flooding in. Some were gleeful. Others were furious. But all of them agreed on one thing. It was time someone like Richard Whitmore was held accountable. Camille turned off the screen. She didn't understand yet that the floor beneath her life was cracking. Later that evening, the sun began to set in thick orange bands over the ocean, painting the resort in a glow that felt almost too peaceful to be true. Tariq sat on the balcony alone, knees pulled up to his chest, arms wrapped loosely around them. He heard the door slide open behind him. Amelia joined him in silence, placing 2 cups of peppermint tea on the small table. She didn't speak until he did. I thought if I just stayed quiet long enough, people would eventually just stop seeing me as different, he said. They didn't, she replied, but today they saw something else. He looked at her. What? Power. Not loud, not cruel, real. Tariq exhaled slowly. You weren't even angry. You were just certain. Amelia smiled faintly. Because I knew I didn't need to prove anything, and now neither do you. There was another long pause between them. This one didn't hurt. Then Tariq asked something he hadn't dared until now. Did you book this trip to prove something, like you knew something would happen? Amelia shook her head. I booked this to give you rest, but I came prepared in case rest was denied. They both sipped their tea, and the silence turned soft again. Out beyond the glass railings, the ocean shimmered with secrets. Back inside the resort, Camille sat alone in her room, staring at her suitcase, wondering why she suddenly felt so small in a place that once bowed to her name. The fallout began quietly, as it always does in places built on reputation. No dramatic press releases, no staged apologies, just a shift in the way doors closed and emails stopped coming. By Monday morning, Richard Whitmore's name had been removed from the management roster of Solaria Resort. His access badge no longer opened any doors, not even to the staff lot. The office that once bore his name was cleared out by midweek. The whispers that had once circled discreetly about his temper, his favoritism, and his quiet disdain for certain guests now found voice, no longer fearing retaliation. Staff came forward, incident logs were pulled, and beneath the polished surface of hospitality, a pattern of abuse was laid bare. At first, Richard tried to push back. He made calls. He sent carefully worded letters suggesting a misunderstanding. He threatened legal action. But no one answered. No one fought back. They didn't need to. The surveillance footage spoke louder than any lawyer could. The testimonies, from the receptionist, the concierge, even the busboys, aligned with painful clarity. The truth was undeniable, and that was the end of it. Within a week, Richard's severance package was revoked. His name, once synonymous with prestige, began to curdle in the mouths of former colleagues. Conference invitations dried up, LinkedIn connections disappeared, He was radioactive. Camille felt the shift in smaller, more suffocating ways. It started with glances. The waitstaff no longer jumped to attention. The concierge no longer smiled. The spa manager no longer asked if she'd like the usual. Her father's absence turned the volume down on her importance, and for the first time she wasn't sure who she was without it. She returned to Wellington Crest hoping to retreat into familiarity, only to find silence instead of greetings. The friends who once followed her cues now looked the other way. Her name, once a shield, now felt like a bruise. There were no rumors, no attacks, just absence. The kind of social exile that doesn't need a sentence, just a silence. By the end of the week, the school's administration sent a polite but firm notice. Camille's tuition package, previously covered under her father's executive benefits, had been canceled. Without payment, her enrollment would be terminated effective immediately. There would be no scholarship, no transition plan, just a deadline: clear out your locker by Friday. She stood frozen in the front office, holding the letter with trembling fingers. She had no words, no backup plan. The halls of Wellington Crest, once her kingdom, now felt like a museum of a life she could no longer access. On Friday, she packed her things into a cardboard box. No one offered to help. A few students watched silently. Some whispered. One girl, someone she barely knew, gave her a small, almost pitying smile. That was worse than mockery. Camille walked past Tariq's locker, but didn't glance his way. He didn't look at her either. He hadn't said a word to anyone about what happened. No victory laps, no smug glances. Not once had he even acknowledged the spectacle. When students whispered about it, when they asked if it was true, he simply shrugged and returned to his book. Dignity, as always, was his armor. He hadn't forgotten. But he refused to turn someone else's fall into his celebration. That weekend, Camille found herself in a public middle school office, standing next to her mother, holding a registration folder. The building smelled of old paint and hand sanitizer. Her name was mispronounced during roll call. Her sweater was 2 seasons out of date. No one knew who she was. No one cared. The silence burned. At home, she watched her mother cancel subscriptions, return dresses, take phone calls in hushed voices behind locked doors. Her father no longer came home with the same confidence. He spent his days searching for new opportunities. None called back. Camille started to notice things she hadn't before. How her housekeeper winced when spoken to sharply, how the delivery driver avoided eye contact, how strangers sized her up in grocery stores. She began to understand. Slowly. Painfully. Meanwhile, at Solaria, change was happening. Amelia Carter did not let the moment pass without action. She implemented mandatory bias and dignity training across the Carter legacy properties. Staff were encouraged to speak up. Anonymous reporting systems were updated. Monica, the receptionist who had tried to speak the truth during the confrontation, was promoted to floor supervisor. Not because she was owed, but because she was trusted. The resort grew quieter in its tension, but more aware. And, amid it all, Tariq remained still. A presence without theatrics. A reminder without needing to speak. He finished his school projects on time, attended his mentoring sessions, and carried himself with the same calm he always had. Except now, people looked differently. Teachers paused to hear him out. Students held the door longer. The whispers that followed him no longer questioned why he was there. They marveled at how he stood through it. One afternoon, Amelia asked him again how he felt about it all. "I didn't want anyone to be ruined," he said, voice even. "I just wanted to be seen." She held his hand a little longer than usual. There was no need for more words, and somewhere, in a small apartment miles from luxury, Camille sat alone in her room, scrolling through her phone, watching the filtered perfection of others' lives and realizing for the first time in her own what it felt like to be seen and dismissed in the same breath. Solaria Resort had always prided itself on silence, not just the peaceful kind that came with waves and manicured courtyards, but the unspoken one. The silence that coded mistakes in discretion, that covered entitlement with professionalism, that buried discomfort beneath linen and lavender. But after what happened in the lobby that morning, the silence cracked. Not because of outrage, not because of press, but because Amelia Carter had made a decision, one that was not driven by image or damage control, but by a belief that leadership meant accountability, not concealment. In the weeks that followed, things changed. It started with subtle things, morning briefings that began with a review of guest dignity, supervisors walking the floor with a more attentive gaze, new posters in the staff areas with bold headings like "Assumption is not policy" and "See the person, not the profile." For the first time in Solaria's long, gilded history, staff were not just trained in etiquette, they were trained in equity. The old culture, the one that relied on knowing who mattered and who didn't, began to fade, not overnight, but undeniably. Employees felt it, guests noticed it, and Amelia watched it all with calm resolve. She did not give speeches, she did not grant interviews. Her actions were the statement. One day, during a closed-door company forum, a young employee stood up, one of the housekeepers who'd only been there a few months. She cleared her throat nervously before speaking. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, "for what you did, for him." She didn't say Tariq's name. She didn't need to. Amelia simply nodded. "Thank you for staying." Meanwhile, Tariq moved through the final weeks of the semester with the same quiet focus as before, but something in the air had shifted around him. People no longer avoided his gaze in the hallway. Teachers no longer spoke over him in discussions. Classmates didn't flinch when he raised his hand. They leaned in. One morning, as he entered his literature class, he found a folded note on his desk. No name, no handwriting he recognized. Just 4 words. "I see you now." He didn't smile. He didn't turn to see who'd left it. He just folded it again and tucked it into the back of his notebook. The same notebook with the bent corners and worn cover that had carried him through humiliation and truth. At home, Amelia framed a screenshot of the hotel reservation confirmation, not out of pride, but as a symbol. Beneath it, she wrote in ink, "They will remember who you are, even when they try not to." Tariq was accepted into a summer mentorship program for young black leaders, a competitive program held at a university 2 cities away. When the email came in, he read it twice before telling his mom. She just smiled and whispered, "You've already been leading." The day he left for the program, Amelia stood outside the car, watching him check his bag one more time. He wore a clean button-up shirt, the same navy color he had worn that day in the lobby. Only now it looked different on him, not like armor, but like a uniform of quiet power. Before he got in, he turned back to her. "Will people ever stop seeing us like we don't belong?" Amelia paused. "Some might, most won't, but it won't matter, because you'll walk in anyway." And he did. As the car pulled away, Amelia stayed there for a while, alone in the driveway, watching the road stretch forward. Across the city, Camille was adjusting to her new life. Public school was nothing like Wellington Crest. The teachers didn't soften their tone for last names. The hallways smelled like bleach and anxiety. No one cared who she was. But for the first time, she had started to care who others were. She no longer made sarcastic comments in class. She didn't raise her hand just to impress. She listened more. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Once, during lunch, she saw another student being mocked for their clothes. A freshman, small, quiet. She stared for a long moment, and then stood up and sat next to them. Said nothing, just sat there. It wasn't redemption, but it was the beginning of something. Camille never reached out to Tariq. She never apologized. She didn't know how, and maybe she knew he didn't need it. The silence between them remained, but it had changed shape, no longer sharp, just complete. Back at Solaria, Monica walked the floors as a supervisor now. Staff greeted her not out of fear, but respect. She remembered every detail of that day, the hesitation, the threat, the look in Tariq's eyes. She carried it with her, as a reminder. Tariq's name was never added to a plaque. There were no headlines celebrating him, but the truth lingered in every changed behavior, every adjusted policy, every silence that now gave space instead of shame. And for those who had watched, the concierge, the chefs, the gardeners, even some guests who had stood in that lobby and said nothing, the memory of that moment had stayed with them. Because sometimes justice doesn't come in thunder or fire. Sometimes it comes in silence, in the stillness of a boy who never raised his voice, who never struck back, but who stood, calm, visible, and unshaken, until the truth had nowhere left to hide. And in a world that too often lets power shout and dignity whisper, this time, the whisper won. Sometimes silence speaks louder than power. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps us share more voices that deserve to be heard.